Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Ian Peake. Ian, welcome.
Hi Dan, great to be back. Nice to see you and hear you again.
It's exciting to have you back on. This is your third appearance on the Sports Psych Show, and with a bit of a difference. You are no longer golf coach Ian Peake, you are golf coach Dr. Ian Peake. Congratulations.
Yeah, who'd have thunk it? I mean, life and the old dog, but yeah, thank you. It's been a heck of a journey. As you and I know, I went to uni for the first time when I was 44.
Right.
I just got finished just before I'm 55, so it's been a heck of a journey, but thanks, yeah. And the journey keeps going. The learning journey keeps going.
Wow, it's just an incredible effort, because I know that your life is packed with, your coaching duties. And so to find the time to complete a PhD, I have absolute admiration for you. You've been on the show a few times before, but it would be wonderful for you to reintroduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work.
Thanks, Dan. Ian Peake. I've been a golf coach now for 35 years. The last 4 years, a lot of my focus has been on, I've been consulting to Swiss Golf Federation in Switzerland, obviously, and my kind of work there focuses on supporting the coaches at national and regional level. I focus on also support the parents of some of the leading juniors in the country, which is fascinating, on, as we say, the psychosocial front. And I also now work with 7 of the juniors privately on the kind of high performance and well-being side. So that's been the kind of last 4 years of work I've had. That's really been very fascinating, a great learning journey for me. And despite that, as you said before, I've been studying the last 6 years my PhD, getting that finished. And with my PhD now finished, we'll talk about obviously some of the content of that later, kind of ready now to spread my wings and the things I've learned in the past 6 years that I didn't know before, get those messages out there to coaches, to parents, to young players coming through regarding, high performance professional golf.
Well, you've given us some clues already as to what this conversation is going to be about. I mean, it's going to centre around your PhD, but I'd love to start with you introducing what that PhD comprised of, what you were actually studying. And as I say, you've given us some clues because you're speaking to, I suppose, when we think about golf coaching, for example, coaching in any sport, we usually think of the X's and the O's, and in golf specifically, we think of golf swing. So I would imagine most golf coaches would look down the biomechanical pathway, the technical pathway, if they're looking at higher education. But you haven't done that so much. You very much looked at the biopsychosocial elements of participation and learning and performance in sport. So yeah, tell us a little bit about this PhD you've been doing, and then we'll start to unpack it a bit.
Yeah, great. Well, actually, it goes back to my master's degree.
Okay.
So I did from 2013 to 16. And I think I mentioned the last time on the show, I've always been fascinated by high performance. And if I put myself into the mix there, why I was such a poor golfer as I was, despite wanting to be better and giving a lot of time to it and reading all the books and hitting all the thousands of golf balls.
We have much in common there.
I know, Dan, I know. So when I studied my master's degree back in 2013, I wanted to understand why 9 really good amateurs wouldn't make it in the pro game. And I was lucky enough to find 9 British and Irish ex-Walker Cup players, which is like the amateur version of the Ryder Cup.
Yes.
And to find out their stories, why they didn't make it. Having been such a top amateur in Europe, why shouldn't they transfer to the professional game? So that took me from 2013 to 16. I was interviewing those participants, finding out their stories, and they gave me a kind of framework of some points why they felt they didn't make it. And there were similarities between all 9. So I realised then, I've learned a lot here, and I've really enjoyed the academia of learning and really going into depth to understand why things work and don't work on the kind of personal side, the people side, rather than the technical side. So I took a year off just to kind of think about the way forward. And in 2017, I started my PhD, not knowing where it was going. I hoped to interview as many successful European Tour players, now called DP Tour players, to find out their stories. And to find out, actually, the group grew to 16, which was fantastic, bigger than I hoped and expected, to find out their stories. And we talk about lived experiences. So, what did they go through during the professional career? If we look at the internet, look at the European Tour webpage, we can find out what they won and where they won, the stroke average and the strokes gained. But what did they experience really between the ears? And what did they experience with the world around them? That's the lived experiences, we called it. So I say 16 individuals who were very kind to me, gave them their time, let me into their life, let me into their emotions. 3 interviews with 14 of the participants, 2 interviews with 2 of them. And that threw up over 1,200 pages of interview material. And no fluff. It was all tough stuff. It was all the lived stuff, stuff that we don't see in the newspaper. And I kind of filtered that to a thesis of 360 pages, and that's my thesis. And the thesis, because the 16 are all pretty well known, very well known to pretty well known in golfing circles, and because of who they are and the stories were so impactful and open, that my thesis remained embargoed. It means it won't go to the public. But what the participants were kind enough to allow me to do was to spread the word through kind of messages like yourself, so that those coming behind can gain from the experiences while protecting their privacy. And that's why I guess I'm on your show today, to pass on, giving their stories life, giving their stories a voice, I should say. This is the point of what we're going to do today.
And before we get on to unpacking that, I mean, I think it would be remiss of me not to say to everybody listening in that I know, I mean, from the conversations that you and I have had, Ian, and I, knowing your work well, I really am. We're talking golf here. We're talking golf professionals who have had, who have essentially made it, and have spoken about the challenges they've had along their journey. But I know that all of this is applicable across all sports, because I've been blessed to, have a professional career in golf and then be a sports psychologist over the last 18 years at the coalface of multiple sports, working with coaches, working with players, and everything that we're about to talk about is relevant across all sports. So I think that's really, really important to say. I think just briefly, before we unpack your PhD and the specifics of the lived experiences of these golfers, can we just briefly return to your masters? And you'd mentioned that you'd interviewed 9 British and Irish golfers who had had a stellar amateur career but hadn't gone on to make it on tour as a professional. Can we briefly cover what you found, what the main findings were from that piece of research that acted as a forerunner to your PhD?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something I've reflected on a lot since I finished my PhD and kind of compared stories. So the big one in going back to the 9 Masters, let's say, participants, these ex-Walker Cup players, 7 of 9 at that time recognised the loss of institutional support. So at that time they turned pro, the lack of support, let's say from the England Golf Union at the time, or Scottish Golf, or Irish Golf, or Welsh Golf. And that lack of support, Dan, it was implicit. It was missing having the buddies there that all would travel with, that they could discuss things with, right? So that came through. That was 7 of 9 talked about the loss of having the family of institutional support, right? The second one, kind of parallel to that, was the lack of friends when they got out there. So they'd lost their social nest they'd had as amateurs. That was kind of tough enough. But there was no one there to fill the nest for them. Again, down to themselves. But they had gone from this kind of busy nest of buddies travelling, social support, to losing that nest and no one filling the nest for them or with them. New buddies on tour. It's a competitive game. It's dog eat dog.
Yep.
Doesn't matter if it's football, if it's rugby. You may be playing in a team, but you want to keep your place in the team, right? So that was the second one. The third one was actually less important but relevant, was the lack of physical skill, physical capital. And that means being strong enough to play the tour. And even then, that was talking about club head speed, the distance the players hit the ball. And two of the players recognised going from amateur to pro golf, they weren't strong enough. So they didn't hit the ball far enough, which in golfing is a big advantage. The course becomes shorter. And the last one, understandably, was after a certain time, the money ran out. No money, no funny. If you don't have any capital at all, any cash in the bank, you're not playing the tour for longer. So they were the four, but I see they made the two standouts with the loss of institutional support, the golf union at the time, and with that, friends and buddies that could help them along the way.
And it's really interesting listening into what you've said there, Ian, because I would parallel that over the last 18 years being blessed to have the opportunity to work quite heavily in the world of football. But I would imagine there were coaches from multiple sports listening in who would see this relevant for their talent development pathways, because certainly in the world of football, as a young player reaches a standard where they're awarded, let's say, a first team contract, when we think of a loss of institutional support, we can think of the lessening perhaps of support as they reach a first team environment away from the academy. Again, this is going to be very, very relevant across multiple sports with talent development pathways. Friends, you talk about friends on tour. And certainly the friends that you've grown up with playing in teams across your talent development pathways, often from the age of 8 through to 18, well, that changes now. And suddenly you're in a changing room, a dressing room with, 25-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 35-year-old seasoned players. Again, a very different landscape. You talked about a lack of physical skill strength. Again, that's going to be relevant because, potentially speed, strength, power, etc., etc. Absolutely for physical sports, and then money. I think that really in elite talent development talent development pathways leading to the elite end of adult sport, the professional side of sport. The contracts can be minimal, and so subsequently young people can become disaffected by that and eventually leave the sport because they haven't got big enough contracts. I just wanted to relate what you found to other sports because again, those psychosocial factors are so relevant.
Oh, without doubt. And I say that was interesting for me, having finished my PhD. To again, what do I find my masters? And I left that deliberately on the side because I didn't want it to influence my PhD findings. I wanted to keep that isolated. But having done them both now and look back, sorry. Again, we're talking about the psychosocial impact and influence around us, and psychosocial as a broad headline is the kind of big thing we're going to talk about today. But yeah, massive. And as you say, I think people are social animals, and having that ability to swap stories, to listen, to observe others, to learn from others implicitly, explicitly. What a great learning tool that is, and what a great loss that is if you don't have that.
Let's get on to your PhD then. Let's unpack some of your key findings. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, sure. So I really obviously put some thought into this before I approached you. There were six novel and significant findings in my thesis, and I think for today we're going to focus on the one, because that's very impactful and very relevant across the spectrum of sports and life, and it's mental health.
Okay.
It's mental health, the mental well-being of elite sports persons. Let's talk, in this case, professional golfers. And I guess my opening line, Dan, would be, so I had these in-depth, intense interviews with 16 successful PGA European Tour players. And at some point during the career, 50% would suffer from depression or anxiety. Now, to frame that, these are all, I'm going to say, stand-up, self-made men. There could have been women if it had been LPGA, but this was, I'm talking about 8 men who really had gone the way, had made the way in life to the top of the mountain in professional golf, and as part of the journey, as part of their lived experiences, would suffer from prolonged depression, anxiety, and that kind of, as you can kind of tell, moved me as the process went along. That's really why I want to get the message out there. That's what I'm hoping to do today with you. Let's speak about this. And having finished my PhD, I've gone back to the participants, the 16 players, and asked them, said, would you be happy for me to speak about some of the stuff we've done publicly? Obviously keeping the players anonymous to protect their privacy. And they've all said yes. And that's me here to kind of give the experiences voice today. And again, me looking back, so what have I learned? I couldn't have believed beforehand these men could have lived these public lives and suffered so badly during those public lives. I know it now. It's moved me enough to say I've got to give these gentlemen voice and get the word out there and try and. I think things are moving, things are improving, but so that they and other people understand, if you go through this, you're not alone, and you may not even be in the minority. You may be in the 50% plus that may suffer with this at some point during a sporting career.
Are you able to elaborate on some of the things they said around this area of mental health and well-being at all? The experience, or ill-being as it is, the experiences they had?
Yeah, I think if I frame that first, and so the listeners kind of get where I'm coming from. So in the course of my research was 30 months, speaking to these gentlemen, and that kind of created this kind of timeline of what they went through. And those most successful had a career that covered 5 stages, okay? And so the first stage, we called them emerging artists. Kind of give it we talked last time about Irving Goffman.
Yep.
And life being a show and you wear a mask and you're an actor. So with the advice of Dr. Martin Toms, my supervisor, this is kind of how I framed my findings. So kind of 5 stages the most successful players went through. So stage 1 was emerging artists, rookies, I guess you'd say, in golf. Those just entering the stage for the first time. The second stage I talked about, I called it moving up stage. So these emerging artists, footballers, golfers, ballerinas, doesn't matter, are moving from the kind of edge of the stage. They're gaining acclaim, they're gaining skill, and they're moving up stage. The third stage of the careers are called limelight, which you could call the glory years, right? Now, the group, as long as things were going well and they were growing, there seems to be little challenges to the mental health. But one of the competitors really struggled when he reached the limelight. And the other 7, Dan, it really kicked in during the 4th career stage, which are called cameos. They were no longer the headliners. They were coming off the high. You could say their career was crashing, a downward spiral. And that's when things hit home. And the final stage of the careers are called afterlife. And obviously for me, when I thought about that at the time, I was thinking of Ricky Gervais, his show on Netflix, as no one did die in my study, but the whole of how he in that story kind of went about surviving the death of his wife. That's why I called it afterlife. So 7 of the 16 really had problems, I say, with anxiety and depression. Obviously, they're closely linked during the cameo period and then into the afterlife. And of those 16 participants, 4 still suffer now, and they've been away for the tour for more than 5 years. Now you asked about, I've picked out some quotes here, and I'll read a couple. So these quotes are all obviously anonymised, so I'm going to call this player Callum. It's obviously not his name. But Callum was a tour winner, and this is something he told me during his period. His career was a downward spiral. Things weren't going well,
Okay.
And this is what he talked about himself. This is how he talked about himself at that time. Callum talking about himself. And the reason I say that, when you hear the first line, you'll think, oh no, he's got the wrong paper, but I haven't. You ready? So this is Callum talking about what he was going through. I love my father. My father got me into the game. I played golf since I was 5 years old. I love him. And yet every night I was going to bed, I was hating the game. I was starting to resent ridiculously, wrongly. I started to resent them for even getting me into the game. I was having absolutely no pleasure out of it at all, only pain. I had to break away from it, not because I could ever hate him, but just because, all these emotions that I was struggling to deal with. Ultimately, self medicating with alcohol in the evenings, those feelings towards the people you loved. So they have a situation for me as a social psychologist. Cam got to such a position, he was in such a hole, and you'll understand this better than me, hating the whole world around him for the situation that he was in. And stories like that, they weren't uncommon. So for me as a researcher and a coach, these are things I've never been aware of. I've coached for 35 years, but I think that's a fairly accurate representation of what a lot of these players were going through during this cameo phase, and how deeply, as you know better than me, the life situation impacts on how that deep that life lived experience becomes, how painful it becomes over a long time.
It makes me think, as you're speaking, that a golfer isn't just a golf swing. A footballer, soccer player isn't just filling a position on the pitch. The basketball player isn't just doing something similar on the court. That it's important for all of us in sport to recognize that participants are people, and people consist of, in very simple terms, thoughts, emotions, feelings, inner sensations, inner drivers, impulses, and that those sort of collide and collate to create inner stories, inner narratives that influence one's feelings about participation in their sport and heavily influence their well-being and mental health.
Yeah, I mean, it's my masters was a game changer, and I've come out of this thinking I coached for 35 years with some pretty good golfers.
Mm,
You know, and not everyone can do this. Not every coach maybe can or should go to this depth of understanding of their players, but to understand that depth of feeling will be there should again add, what's the word? Should probably act as a traffic light system
mm,
to just ask yourself, where is this player at?
mm.
Who is supporting this player, this individual, this dad, this child, this brother, this sister? Who is supporting them to be in a good place anyway, to have a kind of healthy baseline to live from? I've got another one here which is quite interesting. I just pulled up here.
Please.
Here we go. This is Lawrence. Lawrence is again tour player. Now, I've talked about Callum before. Now, Callum was a winner on tour, and so was Lawrence. And this is now Lawrence talking about this mental situation in that cameo phase, as things were. He was on the slippery slope. The situation I was in mentally, you didn't want to reach out to anybody like that, because you're nearly telling them, nearly saying to them that you're a failure. You failed. It was much easier while you were learning to ask questions, because you were gathering information and you were growing and you were participating. But when you're on the other end of the stick and you're on the way down the hill, it's much more difficult to accept that and to say to people, I need help. Now, when the players finished their careers and they moved into the afterlife, what kind of, I guess, shocked me as well, that they almost often thought they were on their own. They thought they were the only person feeling this. And these are world-travelled men, strong individuals, all got social media. We're talking about just 5 years ago situations. but they felt what they were going through would be down to their weakness, and they were in this on their own. And again, if my message today is to try and get some air into this, that in a small way, to say, look, you're not on your own. 50% of my participants suffered anxiety or depression during a career which many would view as successful. They were winners, they kept the card, they played Ryder Cup. And 50% were in dark places, particularly towards the end of their career and after their career, on their own.
It's interesting that Lawrence, again to emphasize not the golfer's real name, but Lawrence mentioned that if we take your stages, Ian, emerging artist
Yeah.
and moving up stage, it sounded to me like at that stage Lawrence gave himself permission to ask questions, potentially to seek out help for various things possibly related to his game and his mindset as well, and maybe even for himself as a person, as a human being. But uh, as he reached the limelight and as things transitioned into the cameo stage, that interestingly and potentially the perception he had of himself as a successful golfer, a successful sports person, and maybe a star golfer, meant that, well, I can't ask for help anymore. I have to know it all. It's almost, I'm not
Yeah,
suggesting that's definitely what he's saying, but it almost feels that way.
yeah. I mean, I think one of the, as we talked on the last show, I mean, the two kind of I say scientists behind that kind of support my structure.
Mm,
One was the Frenchman Pierre Bourdieu, the other one was Erving Goffman. They kind of created the framework for me, Dan, to work from. So I'm viewing this life on tour. On one side, with Goffman, the stage, the actors playing the part, wearing the mask, and the other side on Boobs, actually the habitus, what's inside and what ticks. Who is Dan Abrahams really? Who is Ian Peake really when the lights are
mm.
off? When the public isn't there. So part of Goffman's work is on stigma, self-stigma, and public stigma. So in my language, you're absolutely right. Once the players had left the limelight and were on the way down in the cameo phase, they started to feel bad about themselves. And a stigma, is that sign that you're no longer belonging to the in crowd. And the sign for them was missed cuts, new tee times when they're playing with less, let's say, less successful players.
Yeah.
No more TV time, less interviews, and the previous friends dried up as well. The friends, in quotation marks. But there's another aspect there with kind of in that kind of area, public stigma. So others also made it become clear that they were no longer in the in crowd. And you have this kind of almost deep bowl of spaghetti where these things are being mixed and round they go, and you get that confusion in the player's head and all of these dark mental thoughts that appear. And we have two things. The world around them may be suggesting you're no longer the player you once were, you're no longer the person you once were, and also the self-doubt. And that's, I guess, a kind of magic recipe for depression, anxiety. It seemed to have been, as the players saw it.
You're speaking a lot, Ian, to the experiences in the cameo stage. I know from my own work, my own consultancy practice, conversations I've had with players who've had the perception would be very successful careers, and they're coming to the end, or they're at the end. They're perhaps into what you might describe as the afterlife. And so what kind of conversations were had there? I mean, I'm sure the afterlife is a stage that players had to navigate with great difficulty.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that was interesting as well. So we talked about the seven players there that really struggled with their mental health and well-being towards the end of their careers. And at some time, they were done. They were finished. They didn't want to do it anymore, or fight for a tour card anymore. Um,
Hmm.
And for some of those, Dan, leaving the tour, it was a relief. It's like, God, I've got a thing that there's something to move into.
Okay.
So the point there, I would say, is if those that were struggling, that had something to move into, their exit actually was a relief for them. It was nice to get away from what they had. It was nice to get away from the struggle they had, right?
Hmm.
And it's talk about this kind of planning for life after support, right? For the 5 players that didn't have a plan after tour life, I talked there about them falling into darkness because they'd struggled as the career had finished, they'd quit, and they didn't have a plan for going forward. For those that went into relief, they had a plan, they had a job offer, they had something, they had light at the end of the tunnel. I've got a couple of quotes here. I don't want this to be too depressing, but I've got a couple of quotes for you here.
No.
And this is again from Barry, again, an alias, a pseudonym for the research. This is what Barry said after having quit and kind of gone into the afterlife. Barry said, I almost wanted to derobe of being that person, the person that I was. I went for therapy. I was just really sad. Probably I was depressed, but I was definitely sad. Financially, I wasn't in a great place because I lost a lot of money in those years. With a property crash here. It was kind of perfect storm, really, and things were pretty tight. Emotionally, I was struggling a lot. I've got another one here from Lawrence is back. And Lawrence said, again, about his kind of afterlife, early months and couple of years into the afterlife. It was a struggle, to be honest with you, for both of us, he and his wife. I was going through the loss of a career. I was going through this, what would you call it, complete and utter loss. It was like losing somebody in the family. I was depressed. I was mourning for a career that I once had. I was a horrible person to be around because I didn't know what to do, how to do it, or where to do it. And as tough as those 2 stories are, they were fairly representative of coming off the tour. I guess you recognise it with football players as well.
Yeah.
And what's next? It's not just the loss of money, whole social stature, the being, the symbolic capital. And if there's nothing there to fill that life they've had, it's quite a fall. The afterlife's pretty dark.
A loss of identity, a loss of a way of life, a loss of, in golfing terms, friends on tour, things that you've been doing for years. Absolutely. It makes sense to me that
Yeah.
the afterlife is managing, to a degree, can be managing loss.
Yeah, big time. And interesting, we talked before about my master's degree, and you and I both being coaches, and your audience being coaches, and there's that kind of mixture there of them pulling back, but also no one coming in to say, "Do you need some help? Are you okay?" Or the right people not being there to come in and say, "Look, can I help you? How are things?" Because I said they seem to think they were on their own in this and kind of living with their own thoughts. And now when you've got time and you don't have something to fill the holes that you've had, your head can be, for them, was a pretty dangerous place because the thoughts just went round and round. They didn't have an escape.
When you reflect on all of this, the words from these golfers,
Yeah.
the experiences they had in Limelight, Cameo, Afterlife,
Yeah.
what does it make you think as a coach? What does it make you think as a coach that's potentially important to do pre those stages?
Whoa, good question. I think you need to be aware of who you're coaching. First of all, let's say age-wise and where they are. But without doubt, part of the job I'm doing now with Swiss Golf is to make young players and parents aware of every stage you're going through now has an impact. So the first thing is obviously education. Let's say early education of players, athletes, of parents, of Golf Federation officials, who, with all due respect, a lot of them don't know a great deal about this stuff because I guess it's kind of been taboo for so long. So again, if I go back and think, okay, what do you say? What does this mean? What do we need to get ready? early education and mental well-being, coach responsibility for the language, the body language we use, and especially the parents. Especially the parents. I mean, they're the best coaches hopefully out there. So the language the parents use. It was interesting, of the 16 participants, there was 32 parents involved. One participant parents were divorced, but both parents were involved in the child rearing process of the young child who became a tour player. So of those 32 parents, there was only 3 parents, according to the players, that spoke harshly to them ever about the golf. The other 29, 90%, it was all nest, catching them, you're okay, we're behind you, keep going, you're doing fine, we love you. Now, I would ask, among 90% of less successful child athletes, how are the mum and dad talks there? How is the car ride home with them? I don't know. But what I'm fairly sure of, 90% of parents of successful tour players were 100% positive and non-critical of the performance and the effort. I think that's important.
So, parental attitude, parental influence, social support around the player, awareness of the evolving perception of the player in accordance to the stage they're at. Those kind of factors could be important for coaches, for organisations, for talent development pathways to consider with relation to your research.
Oh yeah, massive, massive, massive. In my opinion, I'm saying, okay, the players. Let's say the 8 players that suffered during the course of their career. They got there. They made it. These are the successes.
Yeah.
I mean, the downward spiral had nothing to do with their parents. The parents had done the job. If you take a step back, why? Because I found out 90% of those parents involved were only supportive, positive, constructive, gave the players a net to catch them when they fell, when they were young players. So explicitly, I guess I would say one of my messages today to your listeners was, parents need to really think about every word they say, and it does have an effect. Now, interestingly, the 3 players that talked about critical parents, they, I would say, never really forgave them, the parents. They never forgave them for the things they said, for the harshness of the delivery.
Okay.
They moved on. They were okay. And it was actually only late in life they came to terms with, as they said, the sins of their parents, the words they used. There was no physical violence, but it was late in life they came to terms. Yeah, one actually said the sins of his father, because he had brought it from his father. I know it's tough, and I really didn't before, and I didn't expect we were going to go down this road quite as far. But I think every word's important. There's no fluff. And for me as a dad, and these things have shaped me now at 55, that every word I use with my kids is important. It doesn't always need to be, the world's beautiful, but every word is shaping them, as we've been shaped by our parents before.
It's fascinating stuff, and I acknowledge that we've spoken at reasonable length to 8 of the 16
Yep.
participants in your study.
Yep.
Accomplished golfers who had experienced what they might have described as depression or anxiety, low mood, during certain stages of their career and post-career. I also acknowledge that leaves 8 or so, 16, my math is half decent, so
Yes.
8 of 16 who didn't experience those. But I would imagine, very much your PhD emphasizes the psychosocial, the biopsychosocial, body, mind, world, if you like, and the interaction between those 3.
Yep.
So it's less about golf swings, technique, strategy, physicality, although I'm sure they all played a part, but less about those.
Yeah,
And more about those psychological and social factors. So, can you speak a little bit to what your PhD uncovered from the conversations you had with
yeah,
those players? Because obviously, well, it sounds like they didn't experience those kind of maladaptive emotional responses in their career, but I'm sure psychosocial played a massive part.
yeah. What's interesting, Dan, so from the other 8 of 16, right,
Mm,
4 had the most successful careers. So where I'm going with that is actually, let's say the top 4 were 4 of those 8.
right.
So the point is where I'm going with that briefly would be things are great when things are going great. If I can stay on the train and ride with the train for the at that top level, things are pretty good. Now for the other individuals, let's say the 4 of 8, it was certainly a case of managing it, the
Mm,
situation better. Then you'd look at their personalities involved, which was beyond the scope of my study. So without doubt, the downward spiral, the 8 of 16 or 7 of 16 experience at the end of their career is without doubt that combination of me and the world around me. No one's blaming the world around them. It was always a combination of, let's say, I'm going to say the world around me and how I react to that. How I see the world, how am I reacting, what am I doing, and what is the world telling me? So within those those 4 of 8, I would say again it's that psychosocial combination of how do I deal with this? Are these skills I've learned as a young man? Are these skills I deal with on the tour? Are the interactions at a later stage with my parents better? So it's very much in a similar situation that 4 of the 16 would react slightly differently. So the impact of what they went through was less important, was less hurtful. So again, it like use a coach, and you're dealing with 2 players going through similar circumstances. One deals with it better, the other deals with it less successfully. But for those 8, coming back to the 8, I'm going to say sufferers, there was no one there for them that was really in a position to help them out of that situation. But on the other side, they didn't maybe look for someone because they didn't feel that was what you do. They had that kind of vicious circle.
yeah. You mentioned learned skills there. That learned skills are a mediator of your capacity to deal with the challenges thrown at you
Yes?
during these stages.
Yeah.
And so surely again coming back to talent development pathways, the environment around somebody, no matter their sports, the practices, the processes and the practices of coaches, on the grass, on the court, on the course, that these skills are ideally injected into those processes, practices, environments.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if it's a magic wand in going forward with coaching, and also parent coaching, it would obviously the first thing would be with these learned skills would be new skills for coaches and parents and athletes. And one of the rules I know it's going around is it's okay to not be okay.
Mm.
It's we're here for you. There's a safety net. You're always going to be loved. You're always going to be respected. That's someone learn skills that obviously I think the more present they are, the safer it's going to, especially maybe in the later life, the safer athletes may become because those are the bits of the iceberg that are hidden, bits of the character that we're not aware of, maybe, but they are shown when you have these long, and these players, the 8 there, Dan, and we're talking about a downward spiral of up to 10 years because they were fighters. 10 years of struggling, of coming off the limelight, 10 years of cameo roles. Every year your role becoming less and less relevant to the tour because you're not producing the scores. That'd be future reference for someone else, future research for someone to say, okay, at that phase, during the cameo phase, if we can unpack that to find out, where do you think these things started from? What were the early indicators for you? That'd be someone way smarter than myself.
Not at all, not at all. And of the 8 who didn't report depression, anxiety, who went through a career without those kind of mental health challenges.
Yeah.
What interesting data, conversational data, arose in your study about them, would you say? What did you personally learn from them as a coach?
Yeah, it's interesting. If we go into the afterlife first of all, the
Mm,
afterlife, Goffman taught something called removal activities. And removal activities is doing something to take your mind off the pain. So removal activity could be cutting the grass. It could be putting 3,000 slates on your roof. So of those that suffered less, there seemed to be more self-directed removal activities.
okay.
I'm going to do this to deal with the situation in the short term. Um, so that would be one thing that stood out in the afterlife once it come off was I'm going to get busy doing something to take my mind off what I'm going through. Now it was kind of short term, but it was fine. It was day to day. Doing this, things will get better. And things did get better.
And through the other stages, was there anything interesting that came out of your research that these participants were engaging in that helped them experience mental well-being, positive mental health throughout their career?
Well, I think, again, being accurate, they all talked, 13 of the participants had career that didn't take them to the 50-year-old mark, right? So 13 left the tour early.
Okay.
8 identified as with depression, anxiety. The other 5 there, it was pretty much dealing with it. It wasn't as bad. It was getting through it. It was kind of accepting the situation. I'm going to keep trying. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. There was certainly not a great deal of pleasure involved, but they didn't identify as being depressed or suffering from anxiety.
That's interesting. Just interjecting a second.
Yeah.
Are you saying that of the 16 participants in your study answering these questions, not one of them consistently answered with words like joy, enjoyment, thriving, flourishing, love, those kind of words and themes with relation to their golf career? Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is a great question. During emerging artists, moving up stage, and the limelight years, I mean, they were riding the wave.
So they're performing well, they're getting results. So
Exactly.
what you're saying is any kind of positive emotion experienced during that time is reported as a consequence of results more so than anything else.
Yes, absolutely. Oh yeah, they're there to play and compete and fulfill their dreams. And what happens as we go along, so these players, let's say most of them come onto tour as single men, have success, get married, have kids, build a big house, have a couple of nice cars maybe,
Yes.
and all of a sudden there's financial
Mm.
commitment there. So all 13, as soon as they hit the cameo years, no one was having fun. This wasn't like, well, this is still quite nice. No chance. Because every year the capital's drying up, the cash is going, the friends are kind of disappearing, sponsorship's gone, there's no TV time. They're on the way down. So now I kind of get you. I was thinking before. Now I can no. There's no. Once these 13 men had passed the glory
Mm.
years, the limelight, it was pretty much downhill. And the big start of it, and this you see the literature, I think fairly what makes sense. Literature talks about the greatest source of anxiety is loss of form, because that's what professional sportsmen's out there for, to perform, to make cash, to be on TV. If I don't have that anymore, and that's all I've got in my life, I'm on the slippery road. I'm in the downward vortex. So all 13 suffered mentally as soon as they hit the cameo years. But the greed, Dad, was how much? How much did I suffer? How bad was my lived experience? And the lived experience was painful because, first of all, the loss of cultural capital, which is my skills. Then the loss of my economic capital, which is money. And with that, a loss of my social capital, which are my so-called friends. And they all 13 had that thing going on. But as I said before, it's how did they deal with that? And I think that's the interaction between the person and the world around them. But from that downward stage, there was no more fun involved. They were doing a job and they were fighting for the house. They were fighting for the car.
And in the early stages, or the first 3 stages, the fun was predicated on performance, on
Yes,
form, on outcome.
absolutely. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Right, right.
Absolutely. I mean, it's absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, this right. They call it, a lot of the lads called it riding the wave. When the moving up stage and limelight, they were riding the wave. Life was good. Life was simple. I was riding the wave. Couldn't wait for the next week. Kind of understandable.
As a golf coach, working with a national association, knee deep in working with young people striving for a career in this area, or striving to be the best that they can be to search for a career in this area. How do you view this landscape? Because I know, and the 250 odd episodes on the Sports Psych show so far have uncovered a lot of work from sports psychologists striving to broaden the narrative here
Mm-hmm.
around how one defines themselves within their sport, that it's not just performance will always be there and outcomes will always be there. Nobody denies that, and nobody denies the importance of any talent development pathway
Yeah.
incorporating negative emotion into it, that because that is part of life. But in sports psychology, my understanding of our landscape, and certainly in my own consultancy, we're trying to, well, I suppose, create more sophisticated relationships with performance and competitiveness and outcomes, and more multi-dimensional lenses of motivation.
Yeah.
So, as a golf coach, having done this PhD research project, is it is it does it mean that you're now tailoring your messages to these young people about broadening their identity, having motivation beyond outcomes and performance, that this is possible to be a tour player and have identity beyond I'm a golfer, and have multiple forms of motivation and commitment, and be able to keep a rational mindset irrespective of outcomes and performances? That's what's going through my head at the moment, Ian. I mean, what does that mean for you as a coach?
Oh, great. Paul, I mean, I think the road I'm going on with Swiss Golf and the direction I'm trying to support them, especially these younger players, is being as positive as possible in warning them, get ready. If you really want this road, it's going to be rocky. Dave Collins, the rocky road. So let's get ready and get prepared for that. We are going to support you. There'll be highs and lows, and getting ready means, for sure, having multiple identities, having a safety net to fall back into. It's interesting, Dan, the 16 participants I worked with were good enough to help me. The leading three all had an education beyond golf before they turned pro. They all wanted to make it as tour players. They were going to see again, and they didn't go into it thinking I'm going to be a star. They didn't. They all turned pro. I want to see how it's going to go here. I wonder how far I can go. No one thought or talked about I'm going to play the tour. I'm going to win majors. I'm going to play multiple Ryder Cups. They didn't. The top three all kind of went, I'm going to see how this goes here. And they all had an educational certificate beyond golf before they turned pro, before they went on the tour. And that was interesting. If that, again, that bit of the iceberg would only really gives them that bit of safety, that if this doesn't work, I'm okay, Jack. I've got someone else I can really fall back on that has some value. So to answer your question, at junior level, the players and the coaches I'm working with are trying to support, and the parents would be, this is a tough road. The players that want to go this road, we need to support them. We need to make the safety net as strong as possible to catch them when they will fall. because they will fall. And going along the road, and at that, go back to the PCDEs and all the other good psychological stuff, develop those things early with obviously huge integration of the parents. No parents, no bueno. It's not going to happen. That's what we do at the early stages. And as a player's career progresses, they're just going to need permanent psychosocial support. Life's, I don't need to tell you, it's not a, if the player's only reporting when he or she's in a crisis, no, that's no good. The player needs, in my opinion, as much psychosocial support as physical support because it's so tough. It's so tough to get there, it's so tough to stay there, and it comes at a big price. And for 8 of the 16, the price was the mental health in getting there and losing it.
As a sports psychologist, as a sports psychology consultant, Ian, I'm passionate about what you're speaking to there, the psychosocial support, how it can be injected into coaching practices, coaching processes on the grass. There's often limited time, not for every coach, for coaches who have greater resources, who have a broader environment around them because they're in well-resourced talent development pathways. Maybe they have the luxury of greater time with players, with participants, but for many, they're coaching in limited time frames with limited resources, and so I'm pretty passionate about incorporating these psychosocial skills into sessions, activities, and so on and so forth. And I'm assuming for yourself, outside of any kind of presentation, speeches, lectures that you give, to Swiss parents of young golfers, that you're having conversations within your coaching sessions with young players. These kind of conversations, you are forewarning them, you're helping them anticipate these challenges in the many conversations, even between golf shots. I'm assuming, you're hitting golf balls, instructing them from a technical perspective, but also interrupting that with really meaningful and important conversations around this side of things.
Yeah, and hat off to Swiss Golf. They got me on board. It's actually Stuart Morgan got me
Yes.
involved 4 years ago. Stuart asked me to get involved, and they've embedded me. My work, I'm not a psychologist. I would say I'm now a social psychologist, as well as a golf coach. And so the work we've done is very much, it's a teamwork. It's me with the coaches, with the parents with the coaches, the officials with the coaches, with the parents, with me, and everyone trying to get on the same hymn sheet. And you know, again, this is interesting. The big thing for me is still the parents. I did with Swiss Golf Support. I did last year at tournaments. I think I did five. No, I did four. Sorry, parent seminars at a tournament. Where they're all there, right? And we advertised them. We got them out there. And maybe it was 100 kids playing, and 10 parents came to each meeting. They were on the golf course watching the kids, which is great, and I get, but 90% weren't signing up to the idea that maybe we could help them with the golf education of their children. Now we're going to keep going. We're going to keep going, and 10% is okay. And finally, if the 10 kids, the 10 parents that tend to turn up are the 10 kids at the best, you know. So we'll keep going, because we've got this kind of, I think this network is being developed. Swiss Golf are getting better. Had a great year this year on the amateur side. Some really good performances in amateur golf. So and it's nice to see that it can work, and it does work. Embedding that psychosocial framework into normal coaching through the coaches, through the players, through the parents, through the golf union officials. So I think, there's good days ahead, but lots of work to do.
To finish off this fascinating conversation, Ian, I know those listening in will have been gripped by what you said if you could condense for us, and I know the difficulty of that because this is a very complex and nuanced area, but if you can condense for us sort of, between 1 and 3, dare I say this, tips, tools, mini bits of advice that that can that can point, whether it's parents, coaches, participants themselves, in the right direction, that condenses everything that we've spoken to so far and that your PhD covered, what would they be between 1 and 3?
Well, first one, I mean, every word counts. Every word you use as a coach, a consultant. And now let's go to younger players, but also older players. Every word you use must count, positively count. The second one, probably because it's quite easy, would be listen more than you talk. And probably the last one I would use would be, I think one I tend to use a lot, reflect a lot on past successes, young players, to help reinforce the future. So not a lot of space for negativity. I would say those three things across the board, and actually maybe that's a discussion for next year or next time. If you're a coach, you're an interviewer, and interviewing and gleaning information. So kind of all those three things make a good interview and a good coach as well, don't they? And about understanding the other person, whether it's a child, an adult, and what they're going through.
Really interesting stuff, and lovely and succinct at the end there. So that's absolutely perfect. Great job on the PhD. Important research, and I know it's embargoed, but just utilizing platforms like this to get some of this really important information out there, key findings on the experiences that athletes have at the very highest level. And we need our talent development pathways to reflect the challenges that these athletes are facing. Ian, I know that you would have tapped the interest of everybody listening in. So how can people find you, follow you, and potentially get in touch with you?
Yeah. Well, firstly, thanks, Dan, for giving these players a voice. I mean, I hope I've just been a funnel for their voice, which has been silent so far. So to get me on X, used to be called Twitter, didn't it? I'm at Ian Peak Coaching, and on LinkedIn, Dr. Ian Peak Coaching. So X at Ian Peak Coaching, and on LinkedIn, Dr. Ian Peak Coaching.
Brilliant. Ian, I can't thank you enough. Thank you so much for today.
Thank you, and thanks to your listeners. Thanks, Dan.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.